Hello and welcome to this business sustainability video by ESG Partners. I'm Matt Thomas, and today we're going to spend a few minutes looking at what we call ESG Essentials, which is specifically for SME scale businesses. And this really is how SMEs can use an ESG framework to identify new opportunities and to help manage business risk. So the first thing we're going to ask is, what is ESG? And there is actually another ESG Partners video that discusses this subject in a bit more detail. But for the purposes of today, we're going to use this definition of ESG, which is an impact assessment and management tool that uses sustainability factors to identify business risk and opportunity. Now, there are three pillars to ESG: environment, social, and governance. And just to give an example of what some of these areas might look like. So under environment, I think we'd be looking most definitely at climate impact on a business. We'd be looking at resource use, waste and plastic, biodiversity, and pollution, both water and air. Social impacts can include what we refer to as DEI, which is diversity, equality, and inclusion. Community and society, that's potentially huge, and potentially also quite volatile sometimes too. Management of human capital, health and safety. These are some of the sort of key social impacts of ESG. And under governance, anti-corruption, risk management, transparency, particularly in financial dealings, and also data security, cyber security, absolutely key element of ESG governance. Any business that holds client, customer data in a digital format needs a robust data security policy measures in place. So this gives you an idea of some of the factors that are incorporated in ESG. It's quite broad. It's not just environment. It's not just but those sort of environmental type aspects that ESG looks at. So you might be asking, as a business owner or business leader, how does ESG benefit my business? Again, there is actually another ESG Partners video that talks about this in more depth, but for the purposes of today, and to put it just into perspective, these are some of the areas where introducing ESG into your business can actually bring some really marked benefit. Some of the things I pick out here are access to finance, access to supply chains, demonstrating that you are aware of and managing ESG risk can mean that from a financing point of view, the risk is deemed lower. You're deemed a lower risk as a company. As a supplier, you're deemed a much better risk as a supplier. Efficiency of innovation, better risk management, reduced operating costs. I won't go through them all, but there's a substantial raft of genuine business commercial benefits that ESG can bring to your company. So let's talk about ESG Essentials. And I think potentially one of the things that puts SME scale companies off looking at ESG and implementing an ESG program is what I believe is an incorrect perception that it's perhaps onerous, lengthy, expensive, complex. And I think for a large organisation, particularly one that operates over multiple businesses and geographic locations, that is quite possibly the case. But for a smaller company, that needn't be the case at all, and you don't need to use the kind of model that a large organisation would use. ESG Essentials, I think, plugs that gap. So we've put together a very straightforward blueprint. It's a 5-step approach that allows SMEs to implement an ESG risk management framework in their business. incorporating all those elements of sustainability, but it does so in a much more sort of cost-effective and time-efficient way, while still maximising that. So as I say, it's a 5-step program, 5-step process, I should say. Let's just take a look at what those 5 steps are. So the first one, the foundation of any ESG program, whatever the size of the business, is called a materiality assessment. And as I say, for a large business, that materiality assessment, looking at all the stakeholders and defining what impacts and risks on the business should be deemed to be material, therefore, actually looked at and managed, can be a lengthy and complex process. For SMEs, that needn't be the case. So this initial process, this initial step, I should say, of defining, is about looking at what the key material impacts for your company are, using them to assess risk and opportunity, and then subsequently defining what your ESG objectives should be. And I will just illustrate that with the next slide. And as I say, for SMEs, this can be a much more simplified process. If you look at what around 95% plus of impacts that an SME will come into contact with, will influence that business through ESG, really boiled down into 5 key headings. Those are on climate, supply chain, essential governance issues, waste and plastic, and diversity, equality, inclusion. Those are the key impact sectors for pretty much any SME in any sector. And I would say that would cover easily 95% of potential ESG impacts. So the materiality assessment for an SME can be boiled down into those 5. Now, there are 5 or 6 sort of subheadings under each of those. All that does is make things a bit more accurate, it doesn't make them more complex. And as far as ESG risk is concerned, again, there's actually only really 5 broad areas. Start with government and regulators, because that's probably the least volatile. Government and regulators, potential for litigation, customers and clients, employees, investors, community and society. Community and society is arguably the most volatile. So if you look at those 5 and you set them against the 5 impact sectors, that really is the basis of an SME ESG materiality assessment. And as I say, there are subheadings beneath all of these things that help refine that model. But it's not a difficult process. It really isn't. And I would humbly say that if you are going through an ESG assessment and it's really tricky, you're probably doing something wrong. It shouldn't be that difficult. So that gives you a little bit of background to that first step in this 5-step ESG Essentials process, defining the material impacts. The second step is to devise a company ESG strategy and an implementation plan, and that needs to dovetail with your existing business model and business strategy. It's not something that sits alongside, it needs to be integral. The third step is to designate. You may have guessed that all of these begin with a D, and I hope that just makes things a little bit easier to remember. So the third step is to designate authority for managing the ESG impact across your organisation, whether that's an organisation of 5 or 10 or 4 to 500. What I would stress is that authority and good ideas can come at any level of business. Absolutely, the leadership needs to come from the top, sponsorship needs to come from the top, but good ideas and authority can come at any level of business. The fourth step is to determine progress through measuring the actions that have been taken and the impacts against the defined ESG objectives, the KPIs. And I think it's probably useful to have an ESG dashboard, maybe a quick quarterly review of progress, and then an annual assessment. And that should be sufficient, as long as the actions are in place and everyone knows what they're doing. And finally, disclose. Tell people about what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're progressing, what you're achieving. Disclosing impact, I think, is going to be one of the next big steps for all companies. And understanding clearly how you arrive at those impacts and what you're doing and why you're doing it is key. And as with any process, it is ongoing. And I think at the end of that, if you're doing this for, say, the first year, you might take a look at your defining step, materiality assessment step, and say, are we doing exactly the right thing? Have things changed? Do we need to tweak anything? Do we need to refine anything? And then that's an ongoing process. So I hope that was interesting, and I hope it just shed a little bit of light on the fact that ESG for SMEs should not be seen as being onerous, shouldn't be perceived as a big cost. It's something that can be relatively straightforwardly implemented in your business, and one that brings, I think, great benefits to your business, great commercial benefits to your business. I'd leave you with one question. What does the impact strategy for your business look like? It might be a rhetorical question. You may not have one in place yet, but I hope that just looking at those few slides we've just gone through, it might start to act as food for thought. Again, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, if you found value, please do just give it a quick like. There are other videos on the ESG Partners channel that look at all other aspects of business sustainability and ESG. If you have any questions, if you found anything of interest, any feedback, please do feel free to get in touch. And I'm always very happy just to have a quick informal conversation if that is something that you would like. So once again, many thanks, and I look forward hopefully to speaking with you in the not too distant future.